It's a real pleasure to have you here. Can I just start by saying that I'd like to recognize one person in this audience, your mother. Before we got on stage, you said, "I can't believe my mother is here."
Well, she's 92, but I was just thinking when she was listening to that description, would she agree with truth-seeking? I think she might remember some storytelling days from my early years when I wasn't exactly 100% truthful.
Well, that's what mothers are for.
They notice everything.
That's what mothers are for. My father, at the age of 92, was asked when he would retire. And he said, "I'm too old to retire."
Can I just say one thing, which is congratulations to Masha Gessen.
Yes, Masha.
So, thank you.
Masha, I should say, delivered an extraordinary Robert Silvers lecture last year, which was in some way inspired, I think, by the 7 words. Her delivery was split in 7 parts, and you must read it. It's in the New York Review of Books. I highly, highly recommend it to you. Since we were talking about your mother, let's stay in the family.
Okay.
And if we could listen to audio number 1.
Wow. That's my dad's music. He was a composer, and he died this last November. It makes me really sad to hear that, but I think it's really beautiful.
It really is, and I discovered it.
So I grew up in an unusual family with music, and my mother was an artist, and there were pianos everywhere, and a lot of interest in what's really beautiful and important in life, as opposed to, just more sort of mundane things. And I think both my parents had wonderful values that made us see the potential of humankind and love kindness and hate cruelty and love art. So I was very lucky to have this kind of upbringing.
Well, I wanted to play this music to you for a number of reasons. Certainly not with the intention of making you sad, but I wanted also everybody here to know that William Mayer's archives are now at the library.
That's right.
They are now at the Library for the Performing Arts, so anybody can consult your father's work.
And not all of them are completely sad. There is a short opera, I think maybe 7 minutes, in which the soprano begins to cluck and then turns into a chicken. So,
so you were brought up in a family that also had great humor.
there were a lot of funny things going on, and my father was very funny. So that was
then,
the Jewish side of my family.
And then you wrote books with the title Dark in it. We'll get to that.
That's right.
Your grandfather, Alan Nevins, can you tell me something about him?
So that was the WASP side of my family. I'm a total sort of melting pot person, and he grew up on a hog farm in Illinois and came to New York to be a historian and became the chairman of Columbia's history department and started the oral history program and American Heritage magazine, and wrote, oh gosh, how many books? I don't know, 40, 50 books, something like that. Won Pulitzers, was a wonderful storyteller, incredible memory, which I don't have. But just so history was revered in my family too.
But he wanted you to be a historian, and in some way you wanted to be a historian. You got lost, you say, in the library.
I did get lost in the library. I was doing a PhD or
on what?
DPhil in Oxford, and I just sat there one day looking at all the books and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I thought, I'll write shorter things that are sort of news stories, and that's when I started stringing for Time magazine instead. I was doing American history in Oxford, and but actually my grandfather's advice was not to become a journalist particularly. It was fun for him, he did that too, but he thought it ruined your writing. You write too much and too fast, and so he may be right. You guys can be the judge. But.
And what has happened to journalism is precisely the need to write very quickly, and not have the time to do the kind of work you're doing. Right,
and write anything down to the size of a tweet, basically. Right. Every few minutes there's a new deadline now. And so, I mean, stopping and dropping out and stopping the clock, basically, is what I started doing when I did the first book about the Reagan White House. I felt we'd been had. I was there covering the White House for the Wall Street Journal, covering Reagan. And we sat there taking notes like stenographers. And then one day, the Attorney General, Edwin Meese, came in and said, well, I've got to tell you, the president's been saying that we don't make deals with terrorists, but actually we've been selling them arms and fighting a secret war with some of the prophets. And everything we've told you basically was untrue, is what he said between the lines. And I thought, I'm going to drop out of this press corps, take a leave of absence, and do a book and tell the real story, because we've obviously missed the whole thing while we're sitting here.
The unwanted truths.
The unwanted truths. I was enjoying hearing about the unwanted truths. There's a Lord Beaverbrook quote I like that says, news is what someone wants to suppress. Everything else is just advertising.
I want to stay one more minute with some of your past ambitions and then talk about your present achievements. This morning, on the train, you told me that one of your ambitions was to have become a cartoonist.
That was my true ambition. And the first thing I ever submitted to the New Yorker was a cartoon. And I got a very nice form letter back. But, and I tried a few more times. But then when I went to the Wall Street Journal, I was drawing caricatures along with the pieces I was submitting. But then it became, I think it violated the union rules for the graphic artists or something. But I love cartooning, and maybe I can get back to it. It would be you know, at a certain point, why is anyone trying to even write anything serious about this president? It should be a cartoon. So
it may be. Okay, I think we're getting into all of that. Let's begin with Franklin D. Roosevelt.
with what?
With Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Okay. I'm not that old quite.
No. In his message to Congress on April 29, 1938, he said, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself, that in its essence is fascism, ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power."
Wow.
What comes to your mind besides wow when you hear that?
It's just, I mean, how fantastic to have a president who would say something like that. And when I hadn't heard that quote before, but it explains so much about the people I wrote about in the most recent book, the Kochs, because they just reviled FDR, and for exactly that reason, because they wanted to be that powerful outside non-government force that overpowers democracy and imposes on it their own beliefs as opposed to what the majority wants. And the father in the Koch family was directly opposed to FDR, and the sons grew up to sort of carry on his vision. And look how far they've gotten. I mean, so I think it's so interesting, because if you tried to boil down one thing that the Kochs have contributed as their legacy, it is to convince the American public that government is the enemy and that the private sector should have all the power. And so it's the exact opposite of what he's saying, of what FDR is saying. And they've come so far in convincing people of that.
In such an insidious way.
Such a sneaky way, really. I mean, and that's why the book was called Dark Money, because so much of this has happened in the dark, where people haven't been able to follow it. They've had such a tremendous impact on America and on so many people's lives, yet most people are unable to connect the dots and follow the money. And it took me 5 years to be able to do that, and it began with my trying to do a story for The New Yorker and being told that they were not doing what it seemed like they were doing at all, and them directly denying reality. And it took 5 years to sort of really explain, oh yes, they were. And this is where the money was going, and this is what it was buying. But it began with them directly having PR people saying they had absolutely no role in the Tea Party. And then I went down to a conference that they were funding, and there they were, not themselves, but their operatives were training Tea Party protesters on what lines to use, what meetings to disrupt, how to disrupt them, which congressman to call. And they were giving out awards for the best Tea Party blogs. And it was just right in front of my eyes. I'm seeing reality, and I'm hearing denials from the PR men for two of the richest people in the country, who didn't want anyone to know what they were up to.
They knew you were there?
They didn't know I was there. I just signed up as a reporter, as myself. I never do anything undercover because I can't really accuse them of being sneaky if I am. And so I was just, but they had probably paid no attention. I'm sure they've got to run a multi-billion-dollar company, so they weren't paying attention. But it was amazingly eye-opening to see this. And it was down in Texas over a 4th of July weekend. And that's when I began to think that they were hiding something. But it took me years to know how much they were hiding, actually. Because even when that story came out in 2010, there was a ton I didn't understand about them. But it was, you know, for a reporter, an investigative reporter, when somebody lies to your face about something, it's kind of like waving that red flag in front of the bull. And it's like, oh, really? So, well, what else are you hiding? And so I kept reporting and finding out more. But they had a family policy that was to be covert. The family saying from their father was, it's when the whale spouts that he gets harpooned. So you need to stay underwater. And there they were out in, you know, one in New York, David Koch's the wealthiest man in New York City, and his brother Charles in Wichita. And they were funding things you could see. And as she mentioned, I grew up in a family in the arts in New York, and I remember turning around the corner at Lincoln Center and seeing David H. Koch that was carved into the building. And it was just when I was beginning to report on this story and thinking, I wonder if everybody at Lincoln Center has any idea what they're doing down in Texas. And I bet they don't know that the same person that's putting this money into these causes here publicly is privately sponsoring all of this hate against Obama. So I was trying to connect the two parts of it.
There's one of the brothers you love.
I like the oldest brother, yeah. Freddie is his name. And he lives here in New York, too. And he...
You think he might be here?
I don't think so. He owns a lot of castles. So he's often in his various castles, including he also owns the Austrian hunting lodge that used to be owned by the Krupps family, I'm sorry to say, but it's where The Sound of Music was filmed, and so he's often someplace else. But he gives money to all kinds of cultural things, and you don't see his name on it. And that was actually what the father and the family told the sons, was it's not real philanthropy if you're trying to take credit for it. But it was you that told me the most perfect phrase describing what these kinds of gifts where you carve your name in the building are, which is rich man's graffiti. So.
And this was said to me without attribution here, though Jane knows it. This was said to me by someone when I was living back in Los Angeles who himself was a billionaire. We spoke a little bit earlier today also about just how important it is to know history. And I told you that I remain so amazed by the American language, by the English language as spoken by Americans, who when they want to speak about something being irrelevant, they say that's history. Which has always continues to surprise me. It surprises me as much as when you go into a restaurant and people ask you if you're still working on it, which is extraordinary. I mean, try to translate that into French. Je travaille encore, you know. But when I said that to you, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say, because I was thinking about Freddie Koch still, and just thinking that, you know, one of the things that it connects to history, but one of the things I loved about working on this book was I love the family histories. I love trying to bring these characters to life, and so that people, you know, it's not just dark forces and just money. They're actual characters and people who are making things happen. But how you can discount history or ignore it or simply not know it is, which is, you know, again, to get back to the resident president, it's amazing, because if you think that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting different results, I mean, definition, I think, of stupidity is not even knowing what someone tried before, and you know, right? It means you can never make any progress or have any advancement if you've never understood anything that happened before you. And and of course, it invites worse things, which is the rewriting of history to make it filled with lies, so that people don't even understand what happened before, and they come to, false conclusions about the founding fathers or whatever else. And so, I mean, I think it's the erasure of sort of our collective memory, which puts us in a really dangerous position.
When I mentioned this to you, you said about the level at which we're distracted. You said distraction is a form of cover-up.
Well, I feel that.
And I want you to unpack that a little
Well,
bit.
I was
What is being
we were talking about the fact that, I mean, to tell history and to do these kind of long-form nonfiction requires a tremendous amount of digging and attention, and it takes time, it takes attention to read it, instead, we're being dazzled and distracted second by second, every minute in Washington now, where I live, by breaking tweets, the latest news. It's not enough to check it in the morning and the afternoon. You really pretty much have to refresh it every hour if you're a reporter, or maybe every 15 minutes even.
I said to you, we need to talk about what happened today, and you said, which part of what happened today?
And then you begin to not remember even the earlier part of today.
So there's some genius in that.
But there is, because what it's doing is it's not unlike what I was talking about earlier about covering Reagan, in that you would sit there being distracted by the sort of the spin and the phony story. It took all your time just to get that. And I think that's what's happening with the country now. None of us can take our eyes off of Trump. It's incredible how addictive it is to watch him. And while you're watching him, and you have to watch him every minute, think of what you're not looking at. You're missing all of the real news about the things that are a little less of a soap opera, but are undoing every, regulation, the so-called administrative state, the negotiations with North Korea and what they really mean, what the Iran deal was really about. It's taking the attention off of anything of real substance and making us just watch this man who's got an amazing ability to make you pay attention to him. And I read I actually did a piece about some psychiatrists who were debating whether or not they should be able to diagnose Trump without having ever spoken with him, and they decided that it would be sort of malpractice. But they did say that sort of one of the definitions of a narcissist is the ability they tend to create chaos around them because it keeps all eyes on them. And I think that's what Trump does. He just keeps it's constant chaos, and it comes out of his experience as a showman on television. So I don't know if you remember, but there was a really interesting piece in the New York Times a while back where it described him looking at every day as the show, and he was producing it and thinking about, what's the arc of the story, where's the drama, what will I, say and where, what will I tweet. It was as if, and it's all about the ratings. And the ratings are his polling numbers. So he's thinking about it as a production. I mean, we're all the audience, and we can't stop.
We're truly distracted from distraction by distraction. I mean, this is what is happening.
Well, this is why I think it's a cover-up, because it's keeping you. It's a little like with those 3-card Monte games.
But I was about to say, you asked me just before we went on stage if I had children, and I told you I had 2. And my oldest son, who is now 16, his passion in life, he had 2 passions. One was magic, close-up magic, and the other was bodybuilding. He wanted to be one of the only fit magicians. Now, the bodybuilding is a little bit less there, but the magic is still there, and the magic is very, very helpful to understand politics now, because you really understand what it means to be deceived.
And a sleight of hand.
A sleight of hand.
And they keep
right
you
in
looking
front
at the
of
wrong
you.
thing, right?
Exactly. And there are those people who love it, and then there are those people who start to resent it because you can't see what's happening. And I think what you're describing, which is interesting, is that you can't keep your eyes off Trump.
Well, you can't.
But
and
maybe
if you hate it.
Maybe one should? No.
Well, I think it's almost futile. As a reporter, I mean, what you can see is that, unfortunately, now you can see the clicks, how many people are tuning into your story. And if you are feeling that no one's paying attention to what you're writing, pretty much all you have to do is put in the word Trump. And it just skyrockets. And, so fighting it is hard. I do feel that if we really wanted to hurt Trump, the best possible thing you could do, and we'll never be able to do this, is ignore him. And I think...
I definitely want us to stay with that, but since you mentioned Twitter, would it be possible to just disable his account?
I have a friend who's made a fortune in sort of high tech, and he was saying his idea was to buy Twitter and then to block him. But I don't know that you could do it. He'd probably find some other means. My husband is the Washington editor of the New York Times, and he has his phone rigged so that it has a special sound when Trump tweets. And it's so terrible. It'll be, we're just going to bed, and suddenly there's that sound, and you have to, and the question is like, do you look or don't you look? But you have to look. That's the problem with it. You have to look. And my dad, whose music you heard before, when he was very old and very sick, he turned to me with a smile, and he was not a Trump fan, but he said, I have to tell you, it's a bad day when Trump's not on the front page. He felt that it was boring by comparison. So that's our problem.
So I'm going to begin with a quotation, and then we're going to go, as if it was a novel, through a cast of characters. As if it was a big Balzac novel, we're going to go through various characters, and you're going to willfully and pleasurably tell us about them. The quotation is, in a way, in opposition to some of the work you've done, but is a magnificent quotation, in my view, by Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world.
Wow. Yeah.
Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
What a wonderful quote.
Isn't
and of
it?
course, you think of it as so optimistic sounding, but this is exactly what the Kochs did. And I think you really have to give them credit in one way, which is they believed in the power of ideas. When they set out to change the country's thinking, way back in the late 70s, they were so far out on the crazy fringe that William F. Buckley called them anarcho-totalitarians. Yeah. And they ran in 1980. Charles Koch, he's the protean figure here. He got his younger brother David to run as vice president on the Libertarian ticket. And they got nowhere. He spent millions of his own money.
He got 1%.
1% of the vote. And the party platform at the time was considered lunacy. And you can look at it, and the remarkable thing is, it's not unlike what the Republican Party platform is now and what's happening. It was about taxes are a form of theft. They want to get rid of capital gains taxes, corporate taxes, income taxes. They want to abolish the EPA. They want to abolish the FEC, get rid of all the things that stop campaign money from people being able to spend whatever they want. You go down the list, and you can see so much of their ideology is now considered almost normal. Even the things that were sort of that still seem slightly crazy, like abolishing public schools, which they call compulsory education. The
language. I mean, I want to come back to that.
Language is very important, but what they, take a look at what Betsy DeVos is doing, which is undermining public schools and taking public money and putting it into private schools as a what is defined as choice, which is they've been very good at language. And what they've done is they've defined the absence of government as liberty. And I think that particular phrase, the way they did that, has made it very hard for liberals and Democrats and leftists and others to argue back, because they've managed to describe this as a state of liberty when you don't have government. And I'm waiting for someone to sort of make the argument, well, isn't that what you have in, the failed states in, Somalia, say? Is that liberty? But people haven't really taken it, pushed it back to them that way. But anyway, so they started this project, and it was in the 70s, and then in 80 they lost. And what was fascinating to me, and what I tried to figure out in this book was, so how did they go from lunatic fringe, which was about where they were when I just started covering politics, to the heart of the Republican Party and in many ways the power in the country? And so and it wasn't just money, because you can spend money and not get what you want in politics often, but they did something so much more ingenious, which was and it wasn't really their idea, it's Friedrich Hayek's idea, because he wrote an essay about how if you want to win in politics, you have to start by winning the intellectuals. And what they decided to do was, they didn't have intellectuals who agreed with them, so they decided to create them. And they created a kind of an intellectual assembly line, and they were both graduates of MIT and engineers, so they had this sort of system kind of the way of looking at things, that, where the widgets were, that you could turn this knob and turn that one and create, something that an engineer would see, and it was how you take over American politics. And they created this assembly line that included subsidizing intellectuals to think like them, creating...
In universities.
In universities, but first
only.
In think tanks,
right.
Putting out publications, but and at first they were very fringy and revealing. They were kind of rough in the beginning, but they got much smoother as they kept going. And they created the Cato Institute in Washington. They started subsidizing departments in universities, and they would have their experts come and testify in Congress, and they kept pouring money in, and they created what they finally described in a tape that has them talking only a few years ago. They were describing as a unparalleled, unified pipeline, where they take kids in universities, expose them to their ideology, give them grants to write papers where they literally count the number of references to Hayek and Ayn Rand and things like that, move them on into the departments in Washington, onto the courts with the Federalist Society, into state office. They've got state branches in 35 states now. Take over the state legislatures as much as they can. They just looked at the whole thing as a system where they could have their ideology just kind of overwhelm it. And they've been good at it.
And I witnessed that firsthand.
You did?
Well, in some way I did in Sun Valley. When you came out, I mean, I think you should tell that story. You were invited I'm on the board of the Sun Valley Writers Conference where we met, and you came out, and there seemed to have been a little bit of a brouhaha and some opposition.
Well,
to
this is
you.
true.
I mean, there were two people that there was a brouhaha and opposition to, you and Andrew Solomon.
Well, it is true that this was last summer, and the Sun Valley Writers Conference is one of those gigs that you just hope you will be invited to, because everything's paid for and you're in the most beautiful place.
Just write another book and come back.
I know, that's a lot.
Okay.
But at any rate, it seemed idyllic, and nobody told me until after I spoke, because they were actually wonderful. They didn't want me to be intimidated or self-conscious. But it turned out that one of the big donors to the conference had tried to cancel my appearance there because he is one of the big dark money donors in the country on the right. And so they're now subsidizing institutes all over the country in universities where they say they're supporting free speech and the free flow of ideas. But when it really came down to it, they didn't want to hear at least my speech, that was for sure. So, but he came, I heard, and lived through it somehow.
And I think he's still doing fairly well.
I hear he's doing very well, yeah.
So
he's at the Manhattan Institute,
he is at
which
the
is
Manhattan,
one of the, there are these nodes of opinion.
He's at the Manhattan Institute and invited me there for lunch, which I went to, which was interesting.
Bring a royal taster.
So a few characters I'd like us to pass in review, if we could, together. The first one will be William Casey. And you wrote about him in Landslide, your first book, co-written with Doyle McManus. And that's a very simple question, is how did he shape history?
Well, I didn't realize, in fact, till my most recent book, that Casey was actually part of the early days of funding right-wing think tanks. And they're actually, if you put these 4 books together, there are a number of characters who run all the way through them.
And
I feel like
all come back.
They never go away.
It's like, when I said Balzac, it is like a Balzacian novel where there are characters that reappear.
It's really
true.
Reappear. It's so
Balzac
strange.
was so interesting because when he died, just as he was dying, he called to his bedside one of the doctors in one of his books to come and take care of him. But at any rate, you were saying.
Well, I mean, and he is, obviously somebody who believed in secrecy. And a lot of what these books are about are people who believe in secrecy, and do things that seem anti-democratic when the doors are shut. So Casey was one of the grandfathers of that way of thinking, running the CIA that was the program for the Iran-Contra affair. Very, very shifty, very clever man, who Bob Woodward said he managed somehow to get into his hospital room when he was dying, and Casey supposedly said, "I believed," and then conked out. So, and a lot of these books are also about people who are zealots.
We'll speak about one of his acolytes, David Addington. And you quote, very interestingly, Colin Powell saying about Addington, he doesn't believe in the Constitution.
Right. And this was after 9/11, and they felt they knew better. And so they created an extra legal program, which when I went to see Arthur Schlesinger Jr. before he died, and here in New York, and I asked him whether the torture program was as bad as I thought it was, and how a great historian would look at it. And he was pouring a Bombay gin and having steak tartare, as I remember, and he looked over these glasses and he said to me, "It is the biggest mistake in American history." So that was the work of Casey's protege, David Addington, along with Dick Cheney, really.
Let's look at video number 1 if we could. You'll see it right there.
I want to be careful here, Tim, because I clearly would be inappropriate for me to talk about operational matters, specific options or the kinds of activities we might undertake going forward. We do indeed, though, have, obviously, the world's finest military. They've got a broad range of capabilities, and they may well be given missions in connection with this overall task strategy. We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
So when he says...
I was going to ask you, what is he saying?
Well, it's so interesting to watch him again, because one of the...
September 16th, 2001.
September 16th.
16th.
So soon after 9/11, yeah. When he says that we're going to need to use resources and methods on the dark, the dark side, go to the dark side, because that's the world in which these people operate. What he's basically saying is, we're no longer going to be the United States of America, a country with a constitution and a Bill of Rights that says that, among other things, you have the right to confront your accuser, a right to a fair trial. You can't be compelled to testify against yourself. You can't be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. What he's saying is, we're going to go to the world where these people operate, and we're going to operate like them. And that's what happened. And for me, it was on 9/11. I was in Washington and working for the New Yorker, and wasn't sure, when something that catastrophic happens, what to do as a reporter. Everybody thought it was only in New York, but actually you could see the Pentagon with these plumes of smoke coming out of it, and there was, the feeling was that, and there were rumors everywhere that more was about to be bombed, and there was a plane had gone down in Pennsylvania that was heading either for Congress or for the White House, and people had been running for their lives from the White House, and you could see their shoes just left on the street, and I was walking around trying to figure out, where to report and what to report, and I ended up that night, I spent all day with, walking all over the city, and I got to the Washington Cathedral, and to this little chapel at St. Albans there. And there was a Episcopal minister named Frank Wade. And he said something that, to me, that pretty much resonated for the way I looked at the whole issue for the next few years, which was, it was the only person I heard saying it. He said, the biggest challenge we face is how to succeed in this war on terror without losing our values and becoming like the enemy. And it was just, I've never met Frank Wade, but that night I thought, that's everything. Are we going to become...
The opposite of what we have.
The opposite of Cheney. Yeah, exactly the opposite.
And he gave you your title.
The Dark Side, yeah. And so this was the story of how our government went in the dark direction and what they were really doing. And it too took years to write and to report, but it was there were so many inspiring people in it. Even though it's called The Dark Side, really a lot of what I write about in that book are the people who are the sparks of light, who are fighting it, and who are risking everything to stand up to it. And they're everything from ACLU lawyers to a very conservative lawyer who was the chief counsel at the Navy, to FBI officers, some of the people in the CIA. And these were the people I was talking to. And you, as a reporter, it was, we know now what they were doing, but you couldn't tell then what this program really was, and that there really was a deliberate U.S. program of torture. And it was only when there was one man I remember having lunch with at one point who was an international human rights person I can't say more about, but he knew about the program. And he said, it's the most terrifying program I've ever seen. It's taken all the world's knowledge of torture, everything that humankind has learned about it, and focused it on these detainees. And they're putting them through every kind of psychological and physical hell that the human mind can come up with. And I just looked and I realized, well, I'm going to have to figure out what this is. And it took years, but that's what it was. So
both Cheney and Casey were unhappy about the Church Committee. Senator Frank Church in 1975 wrote the following: I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America, and we must see to it that National Security Agency and all agencies that possess surveillance technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That is the abyss from which there is no return. So we crossed that abyss completely.
completely, almost completely. They had to get legal authority, but they had lawyers who were pretty much telling them what they wanted to hear. So it's not as if, in some ways it made it worse, because it's not as if these were rogue operators doing something in a dungeon. These were very carefully monitored, thought-out programs that included doctors who would measure people's pulses to make sure they were going right up to the edge of death, but not over it. Anyway, we have come back to some extent from that. This has been a upsetting moment to see Gina Haspel become the director of the CIA, but it's a mixed moment, because in order to become the director, she had to say that the torture program was a terrible mistake and that we'll never go back there again, despite what our president's been saying.
So, just a few days ago, I was interviewing Mario Vargas Llosa here, and I asked him about Gina Haspel. She hadn't yet been sworn in. She was sworn in this afternoon, I believe. So I asked Mario Vargas Llosa what he thought about the turn of events with Gina Haspel, record running a black site and destroying evidence of torture. And this is what he said, and as if Mario Vargas Llosa was in the room, perhaps you can respond to him. He said, if a democratic government uses torture to combat terrorists, it's not democratic anymore. And the terrorists have won the battle. They have convinced democracy and terror is a weapon that you can use because there's no other way to combat terrorism than becoming a terrorist yourself. This is not true. This is an absolute lie. Democracy has not only the moral but political and social obligation not to use terror to combat terror. Because if you use terror, you become a terrorist yourself. And a democratic regime cannot accept this without destroying the essence of a democratic culture.
I think it's absolutely true. He's brilliant, as we know. The question is, can you accept that Gina Haspel is now saying that she regrets what they did. She could have been much more full-throated on this subject.
And do you think she said it because it was the right thing to say? She was advised?
I don't really know. It was interesting that
Do you not really know, or do you not want to
no,
tell
I
me?
really don't know her. I think that the CIA is very split between people who sincerely thought it was a terrible thing that happened, that undermined our moral authority in the world and undermined democracy. And then there are quite a few people that I've interviewed there who, like Cheney, argue that there was nothing wrong with it and that it was just what we had to do, and it worked, so that makes it all right. So there's a split in the culture there, and I really do not know which side she's on, but I have to say, whatever side she's on, even as troubling almost to me, is just that her defense of what she did was that she was following orders. And we've seen that in the Nuremberg trials.
I was thinking about the same.
And the idea of having a president like the one we have, who could give orders that are just unimaginable almost. You want someone who will stand up and say, "I'm not doing it, and I'm resigning, and so is everybody else here." Before we do that, and she doesn't strike me as that person. And unfortunately, among the voices that's been really heroic on the subject, for whatever else you might think of him, is John McCain. And we're going to lose that voice one of these days soon. But he was one of the reasons it became a bipartisan issue. Nobody really could argue with his position on it since he'd been tortured. So. Anyway, so it's almost as worrisome to me about Gina Haspel following orders is also just that she destroyed evidence. And that evidence, those videotapes, which was of waterboarding sessions, I was told when I was reporting the reason they had to get rid of the videotapes was it would be, the quote was, unsurvivable if the public saw them. There would be such a backlash against it. And, I wish people had seen it so there could be that backlash and that people could be as horrified as they should have been instead of being told, oh, this was just something we do in training.
It reminds me of, it's strange what is popping up in my mind. There's a movie by Werner Herzog called Grizzly Man, where he doesn't let one of the former girlfriends of the man who was eaten up by a bear see the images or hear the voice because she wouldn't be able to continue to live. So
Unsurvivable.
Yeah.
Well, and I remember...
And you're describing something that is similar, but that obviously has happened at a much larger scale.
Well, and this debate about what the public could see of this program went on in many different ways, and I remember having lunch once with Dianne Feinstein, who was then the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they were talking about, I think it was photographs of Abu Ghraib and whether they should let them out. And she was saying she was against the idea of letting them out because it might create riots around the world that would then turn people against our soldiers. And I was arguing, no, you have to let them out because our strength is the transparency we have, that when we make a mistake in this country, we let the world know, and that's how we correct it. We don't just hide it. And that in itself is attractive, and sure, there might be riots, but then also maybe it'll make the policymakers think next time before they do something that causes riots when the world sees it.
We're talking about Trump in some way, but let's talk a little bit about Obama, and to what extent did his decision to turn the page on torture rather than demanding accountability for those who oversaw it pave the way to Gina Haspel?
I'm sorry to say, because I have a lot of admiration for Obama, but I think this is something where he really fell down. And they needed to have, I don't think a prosecution of the previous administration, but I think they needed some kind of truth commission on torture that would have made it clear to everybody that this didn't work. It wasn't morally sustainable, that it was a corruption of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. They needed to air this all out, and instead there is a great study that was done of this program, but it was just done by one staffer on the Senate, and it's been swept under the rug. The public has still never seen that study.
That's Drake.
Dan Jones did it, and it's called The Torture Report. And there's a summary of it that people have been able to see. But I've been told that the study itself is in the attic of the National Archives, where nobody can get it. And I wonder how many years it'll take before people get to see the truth of what happened.
So would you want to see it?
Oh yeah, I mean it's something.
And so why can't one?
Oh, it's classified, top secret. You can't get access to it. So, and Obama was part of the. Obama was in part of the cover-up in that case. So
why?
Didn't want to rock the boat against the CIA. One of his top people said to me early on when they were talking about releasing some of this information about the torture program, he said, the last thing a young president with no national security experience needs is a rogue CIA coming after him. So they were kind of afraid to. And then I think it's also very much Obama's nature. He doesn't like to have, I think he always wanted to split the difference on partisan fights, and didn't want to look like he was criminalizing what the Republicans had done. So he just wanted, as he said, to turn the page. But there's a history of this, of course, all around the world, and the history is it always comes out. And you can't really turn the page, and you can't sweep it under the rug. It takes years sometimes, but these things always come out. So that's what I tried to do in the book.
So that's the hope.
It is the hope, and there are plenty of good people who believe it's important that we learn from it. I mean, there are fantastic people in that book. That was one of the nice things about doing that book. There were so many admirable characters, which unfortunately were absent in the next book. So
one of the key moments in the history you tell in Dark Money is the writing of a memorandum of Lewis Powell. It would be interesting for you to tell us who that man was. You write that his memo was a virtual anti-communist manifesto.
It was, Lewis Powell, it was right before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, and at the time he was a lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, working for tobacco companies, among others. And 1971, this was, the Vietnam War was raging, and there were demonstrations in the streets, and corporate America, of which Lewis Powell was a big part of, was getting very nervous about the sort of anti-corporate tone of these demonstrations. And Ralph Nader was rising, consumer movements, the environmental movement.
Let's look at videos 3, just to, might be a good moment.
Would you describe yourself as a revolutionary?
No, actually, I describe the corporations as the revolutionaries. I mean, they're basically the institutions who are trying to upset our basic value systems. And I mean that very, very seriously. If you say our basic value systems, our compliance with the law, our arm's length relationship with the government, our competitive quality competition, our concern for the neighbors, are the avoidance of violent impacts on people, and who are in effect perpetuating all these injustices. Corporations produce most of the violence in terms of pollution and hazardous products. They corrupt governments. They, in effect, make a mockery out of competition and quality in the marketplace as they concentrate the economy in the hands of larger and larger corporations. They violate laws right down the line, hundreds and thousands of them on a company-by-company basis. They're, in effect, revolutionizing the basic ideal pattern of the society.
What a great clip.
Isn't it?
Never seen that, yeah. So this was
you
the
were
face
speaking.
of the enemy to these corporate captains.
Why were they so afraid?
Well, they were about to get regulated. And they could, there were about to be environmental regulations. The EPA was just being created, and they felt that they were under attack. And life wasn't going to be as good as it had been before the movement, the consumer movement and environmental movement. And so a lot of the people who I write about in Dark Money were corporate captains during this period who saw the good years being threatened by the face of people like Ralph Nader. And so what Powell said, but what I thought was so interesting about the Powell memo in 1971 is what he described as the enemy was, he said, it's not the hippies in the streets and the anti-war protesters. He said, the enemy is polite society, it's the establishment. He said, it's the academics, it's the judges, it's the ministers in the pulpits, it's the media. And they are, if you want to win corporate America, and he was doing this for the Chamber of Commerce, writing this thing, he said, corporate America needs to get organized and fight back against the establishment. And so create your own media, create your own academics, take over the courts. It was a blueprint for what actually happened. And this was one of the big followers of the Powell memo, who was very excited about it, was Charles Koch. So, and he said, in essence, I can fund this. And so it was very inspiring to him. And Nader is exactly what his nightmare was.
Let's talk about money in politics through Betsy DeVos. She once wrote the following: I have decided to stop taking offense at the suggestion that we are buying influence. Now I simply concede the point. They are right. We do expect some things in return. We expect to foster a conservative governing philosophy consisting of limited government and respect for traditional American virtues. We expect a return on our investment. Now, you like to point out that dark money donors often refer to themselves as investors. What are they investing in?
They're investing in the American government, the best one they can buy. They want a return on investment. They'll put in their money and get back what they need. That's what they're hoping for. And they're pretty brazen about it. They call themselves partners too,
yeah.
As in they're in an enterprise that they've got, the Koch partners. So there are about 400 or so of the richest conservatives in the country who've banded together, and together they pool their money in this one fund, and they invest in politicians who will give them the best return on their investment.
And here is the person who runs our educational system saying this.
Right. She's, and it's interesting to me, again, I love the family history. She is married to the son of the family that started Amway,
Yeah.
and which was literally charged criminally for its tax evasion. And she's, again, these are people who were out on the fringe who are now in the heart of our government. That investment has paid off. They've kept at it, and it's now been a couple decades. her particular passion was getting rid of any kind of regulations on how much money you can give as a wealthy person in politics. And she helped fund most of the legal cases that brought down various campaign finance laws. So, so she's gotten a pretty good return.
In Dark Money, you write about how Bill Clinton passed several pieces of legislation backed by people like the Koch brothers: welfare reform, Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Why would, in your view, a Democratic president sign into law so many bills that benefit people like the Koch brothers?
Well, this was the beginning of the Democratic Party being the new Democrats and feeling that they needed to sort of tack towards the center. There was triangulation was the term of the day. But also the problem was that by then, I mean, and it's still true, the Democrats need to get a huge amount of money to be able to compete with the Republicans. So they're going to have to turn somewhere for it. And the irony is that the Democrats get more money from Wall Street now, at least they have in several of the last presidential elections, than the Republicans do. Certainly Obama did. And so it's very hard for them to deregulate, I mean, to regulate things like the commodities markets if that's where all their funding is coming from. And that's where you get to the problem with somebody like Hillary Clinton that she ran into, where she was so vulnerable to attack because she was so close with Wall Street. But that's the problem with this is why campaign finance laws have to be reformed, because if both parties have to beg and steal and borrow the money to get elected, they really can't define very different policies from each other.
For the last year or so, we've been doing a program here at the library on the Arctic imagination. So we invited all kinds of different people like Naomi Klein recently, and I quoted to her a line which I want to quote back to you on climate change. Climate change and the Koch brothers. You write that in 2012, the Environmental Protection Agency's database revealed Koch Industries to be the #1 producer of toxic waste in this country. And in The Dark Side, you write about the Bush administration, and I mentioned this before, corruption of language. This seems to be a recurring interest of yours, the corruption of language. Now, this reminded me of a line that I very, very much like of Rebecca Solnit, who published an essay in The Guardian called "Call Climate Change What It Is, Violence," and in it she writes, "Climate change is global-scale violence against place and species as well as against human beings. Once we call it by name, we can start having a real conversation about our priorities and values, because a revolt against brutality begins with a revolt against the language that hides that brutality."
Well, that's really true, and what the Kochs have funded is a massive program to blur what the language is and what the reality and what the science is, so that people don't have a sharp picture of the violence it's doing to species. I mean, literally, I remember interviewing an expert at the Cato Center, which was the think tank that they started, and he was arguing with me that polar bears are better off and doing much better now that all of the icebergs are melting. And you know, all I kept thinking during the interview was, what are they like paddling through the Atlantic? I mean, or the Arctic? But it was.
And what did you say?
I asked to see his studies, and of course there were studies because they'd funded the scientist who was creating the studies, and then it takes so much effort and time to bust a lie like that. I mean, it takes other scientists who are experts, and then as a reporter, you have to find the polar bear experts and look at their studies and compare the fine print. Yes, I did, but the thing is, by the time, you know, the world doesn't have time, really, for the most part, unless you're obsessive, which reporters are, but to bust every one of these lies, and you can do it, but it's going to take you days. And by then, there are 10 more lies, and they're all out on the internet, reaching everybody and confusing everybody. And this has been the problem. So if you've got a subsidized industry of alternative facts, and that really is what what this whole Koch enterprise has been. There was a reality that the establishment, which was academia and science and the law, and all kinds of other thinkers believed, and they disagreed with it, and so they subsidized a complete industry of alternative facts. And now a lot of people are very confused about what the reality is, and we now have a president who's saying that the real facts are lies, and that the alternative facts are the only truth. So it's become even more aggressive in this administration.
What did you tell me today? He wanted to investigate. Who is he wanting to investigate today?
He's wanting the president wants to investigate the investigators. So when I did a piece not so long ago about Christopher Steele, who did a report that laid out his concerns about all of the ties between Russia and the Trump campaign, and he has been just attacked and accused of lying, and of lying to the FBI, which is a felony, which he didn't commit. But people, I mean, it's really interesting and really dangerous, I think, what's going on right now, because I'll tell you, I was having a conversation with quite a conservative Democratic senator, probably the most conservative Democratic senator, but I won't name him, and he said he thought that from the start, Trump's attack on the media and on this whole idea of fact has been an effort to undermine what Mueller's going to come up with and what a real investigation would show about him. And this senator said, Trump knows what he did, and the people around him know what he did, and if you think about it, he's really been working for a year now to just completely undermine credibility of the people who are capable of finding fault with him.
Since you like family history, I want to go back to the Koch brothers, but to the father, to Fred. And read something that you write in Dark Money. You quote a letter in 1938 from Fred Koch to a friend where he says, it's a chilling letter, although nobody agrees with me, you know this letter, of course, I'm of the opinion that the only sound countries in the world are Germany, Italy, and Japan, simply because they are all working and working hard. The laboring people in those countries are proportionately much better off than they are in any other place in the world. When you contrast the state of mind of Germany today with what it was in 1925, you begin to think that perhaps this course of idleness, feeding at the public through, dependence on government, with which we are afflicted, is not permanent and can be overcome. And so my question is, to what extent did Fred Koch transmit some of that wisdom to his sons?
They learned their politics at his knee. They very, very much did. And that, again, takes you back to your first quote. FDR was president then, and what he's saying is what we're doing with the New Deal in the United States is we are creating people who are dependent on government, and a much better model is taking place in Nazi Germany in 1939, and the other Axis powers, which is what he's talking about there. It was one of the things that I couldn't believe when I came across it in writing this book, that the Koch's fortune partly came from building a refinery in Nazi Germany that had to be green-lighted by Adolf Hitler. And the way I found out about this was that there was a family story that the father in the family had almost died on the Hindenburg because he was doing a lot of business in Germany. And I was looking at what year was that, and then I said to someone in the family, well, wait a minute, he was doing a lot of business in Germany in 1939? What kind of business was that in Germany in 1939? And it led to this refinery where he was willing to work with Hitler's government, which was so interesting after he'd already worked with Stalin, because there aren't too many people who've managed to work with both. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that he was a Nazi. When World War II was declared, he did try to sign up, but he did bring home a nanny from Nazi Germany for his 4 sons, and she was terrifying to the boys, and she was such a devotee of Hitler's that when Hitler invaded France, she gave notice to the Koch family, and she said, I'm terribly sorry, but I need to leave because I want to be with the Führer to celebrate at this moment. And so
you're answering the question a little bit. You are answering the question a little bit about what was transmitted.
Well, and what was transmitted was a phobia also about centralized government.
And of idleness.
And idleness, and of a feeling that if government helps people, that it's corrupting people. People shouldn't be given something. Though that's what they say. I mean, one of the small points that's in the book somewhere, but that I felt was important, was that while the Kochs argue then and now that handouts corrupt people's ability to be honest workers, that they have no problem giving their children hundreds of millions of dollars, I mean billions of dollars. And there's a quote in there where Charles Koch is asked about his son, who's now rising up in Koch Industries, and a Wichita Business Journal says to him, well, is this nepotism, and have you, given him maybe a leg up? And he says, oh no, he totally made it on his own. Anyway, the corrupting influence of gifts extends to welfare, but it doesn't to inheritance, which they also, I mean, the Koch brothers each inherited about $300 million from their father. And now Charles and David are each worth $60 billion, according to the most recent thing I saw. And that will go to their children. So. As we
slowly wind down, I want to mention Robert Mercer for a moment. In your New Yorker profile, you write, he has argued that the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was a major mistake. What are some of the other views about race in America that he holds?
Well, Mercer believes, I mean, you have to sort of back up to his fundamental view, which is that, according to people he works with, that the value of a human being is tied to what they earn. So if you earn a lot of money, you are valuable to society. But if you are on welfare, you have a negative value. And so that's one of his views. Another view is also, I thought extraordinary, was his view of nuclear war, which is worrisome given that the family had a big part in lobbying to get John Bolton to be our national security advisor. And Mercer has supported the notion that nuclear fallout outside of the immediate radius of the bomb dropping is good for people. And so he has really eccentric views.
I want us to look at something that might surprise you. If we could look at video number 5, please.
Until white America regains or even decides to identify a moral course of history, I don't think anything is going to happen. I think America will self-destruct.
But the civil rights movement was black and white together.
Yeah.
That's not in the case anymore?
That's the case, but it's not the fact. The case is that we have to fix it. The fact is that it's not fixable if white folks don't decide to change their course of conduct. The only thing left for black people to do is to burn it down. We've been lynched, we've been murdered, and if you look around, never before in my 91 years of history as an American have I ever seen the nation more racially divisive than it is at this very moment, including the days of the Ku Klux Klan and the segregation laws of the South.
Well, Robert Mercer's view was that the Civil Rights Act set blacks back in this country, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to them. So, I mean, the thing about Mercer, he's a brilliant computer scientist. He's a very wealthy man who runs one of the most lucrative hedge funds in the world. And ordinarily, if we had a different kind of campaign finance system, no one would have to pay any attention to his political views. And they probably wouldn't, because they're so far out. But the problem is, because he has that money, he is able to make an investment. He worked with the Koch brothers, and now he has his own organization, and get a return on it. So, I mean, he helped bail out the Trump presidency, the Trump campaign. And when Trump won, he called in a lot of his chits, and he's been able to dictate, or at least lobby very hard about who a number of the top people are in the administration, including Bolton, who he's been very tied to.
I know it's so hard to say, but how afraid are you that we're heading towards a war with Iran?
Oof. I don't know. I feel like every day, I think this is part of the reason we're all watching Trump, is it's not just that it's entertaining, it's also terrifying. And I go back to thinking about one of the pieces that I enjoyed working on most was the interview with Tony Schwartz, who really wrote The Art of the Deal rather than Trump writing it. And I never forget that after I interviewed him, he said a lot of stunning things, but then he sent me an email and he said, just in case I haven't been clear, and he said, I just want to make sure you understand, if Donald Trump is elected president, I fear for the future of civilization. And I just sent back a note saying, can I quote you on that? And he said yes. And I think we're all fearing, I don't know if it will be, Iran or North Korea or the economy, once you've seen this tax bill go through for a few years and the deficit is just unsustainable, or just some other daily madness, because it happens about 10 times a day that there's something so crazy you cannot believe it. And I think it's, as I said, it's not just entertaining, it's terrifying. So, and I live not that far from the White House.
And to some extent, it's terrifying that it's entertaining.
Terrifying that it's entertaining. Yeah, maybe we're learning something about ourselves. That's why people love horror films or thrillers. So, personally, I like Iannucci and the dark comedy, but it's getting not that funny. This particular show. I mean, so you see something like, what people would argue otherwise is so far nothing really terrible has happened except to the environment, arguably, but and maybe to undocumented immigrants here.
Except for that, everything is okay.
What's that?
Except for that, everything is okay.
No, it's just the feeling that anything terrible could happen
At any moment.
Yeah.
You said that Cheney and Rumsfeld in particular understood the levers of power in the Bush years, and I'm wondering who you think understands the levers today in the Trump administration?
Understands power?
Yeah.
I think I've interviewed Bannon. I feel he understood power in a kind of terrifying way also, but he was very seductive and managed to see the possibilities of what you could do if you could manipulate things, which he was doing with Breitbart for a long time, and trying to manipulate Trump. I mean, I feel that one of the worst moments in this administration so far was Charlottesville. You could really see this dark underbelly of what you could do if you spun up the haters, and Bannon was right there cheering them on. So I think he sort of understood the dark side of power. I can't tell with Trump. I just think he's just thinking about himself at any given moment all day long. And he's not necessarily he's not an ideologue, he's not a zealot, he's just plain a narcissist who's gotten a hold of all the levers of power and is serving himself. That's the way I see it.
A closing in two movements. The first movement is, in preparing for today, I told you to look back at your work, and I told you that I might even be quoting Hannah Arendt. And you actually found the very quotation I'm going to read to you, and I want you to react to it. I've used it before, but to use it with you seems extremely just. And so I'll read it slowly, and I want you to react to it fully. So Hannah Arendt wrote the following: the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist.
I think that's such a brilliant quote. This is why when we were talking about her, this is the quote that jumped out at me as well. And so what I see in that is, if I had to explain in some ways what the legacy of the Kochs has been, this 40-year campaign against belief in government, I think has made people so cynical that they think that everybody in government lies and everyone in power lies. And so they think when Trump lies, well, everybody lies. And they don't really care very much. They don't make the distinction anymore about what's true and what's a lie. It's just like, oh, well, they all lie. And so when you have a liar, someone who's lying constantly in office, they just shrug. And that's the ideal citizen she's talking about. These are people who are no longer believing that there's another possibility. And they can easily be misled.
And it takes so much effort to prove that something that is a lie is not a lie, or something that is not a lie is a lie.
Well, and we spend a lot of time at the New Yorker, and the rest of the press corps does, proving what is a lie and what's not a lie. And as we were talking about the polar bears, it takes an incredible amount of effort to get the facts right. And what's been most disappointing, I think, is that we have done that. We do it every day. and it's not necessarily eroding support for Trump. And that's why what she's saying is so brilliant, because what she's saying is you've now got a public that kind of doesn't care.
Yeah.
Because they're so cynical, it doesn't matter. And in fact, what she goes on and says is, you know, they almost feel in on the joke. It's kind of like they don't care if they're being lied to, because they want to say, well, I'm clever enough to know that. And so you can't, you know, it doesn't matter, because I understand that they're all liars. And I feel that if you look at polls, what's happened over the last 40 years is with this huge, multifaceted attack on public service, the public space, the idea of public interest, and the idea of democracy and government being a force for good. This is coming from corporate America, and particularly from the Kochs, not all corporate America, but from their far libertarian wing of it, that what you've got is an awful lot of people in this country, polls show, who have no respect for this joint project that is, you know, the American government anymore. And they're saying they're all liars. And that set the table for electing someone like Trump, who really is a liar.
That's what made it happen.
Yeah, and who knows nothing about governing or about history, and the public felt better to have someone who knows nothing than someone who's an expert or an elitist, or who comes out of the administrative state or the deep state. So let's elect someone who knows nothing. Well, he knows about real estate, I suppose.
I asked you for 7 words, and you gave me 2 sets of 7 words. And I'd like to end on the 7 words I didn't read at the beginning. You say, who, what, where, when, why. So, why?
To be continued.
Thank you very much.